I call the Honourable Member David Clendon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Kia ora. I'm very pleased to take a call on this, not least of all because the Minister has inquired as to why the Greens might see fit to oppose this legislation, and I'm very pleased to list some of the reasons we are doing so. Recalling, of course, that we initially supported this piece of legislation at first reading because we entirely agree that the underpinning logic of establishing some sort of high-order entity that can link business and the community of research, to make that series of connections that will deliver us the high-value exports, the positive improvements. We know that our economy can no longer rely on selling more logs and milk powder over the wharf. That's the past, that's not the future. However, the nature, both the process and more importantly the final structure of the legislation is something that we simply cannot support. And I'll work through the bill and highlight some of the reasons for that. We've mentioned the process. The bill was tabled and first reading 2 or 3 days later. Within 6 weeks, we had to report back from the Select Committee, and at no point have we been given a clear information as to this need for that urgency. And I'd love to hear from the Minister why this had to be done in such extraordinary haste. Because it did reduce the quality of the submissions, and we know this because the submitters told us so. It reduced the number of submissions. It penalised the officials who did a very good job under very difficult conditions to come back in time with high quality work which they're accustomed and committed to providing the committees. All in all, it was a very unsatisfactory process, and not unusually it's delivered an unsatisfactory piece of legislation. The ATI will be a Crown entity, a Crown agent. It'll have very little autonomy. And clearly that is carefully designed as such. We know that the Minister will appoint the board. They will be people selected by the Minister. Clearly this organisation will very much be at the beck and call of the Minister. And that's not particularly helpful given that its prime cause is to build lasting relationships with business. We've all heard the line about the guy who walks into a business and said, "I'm from the government, I'm here to help you." An organisation that is clearly so closely managed and at the Minister's beck and call is not one that's immediately going to win the hearts and minds of business people, clearly. Equally, the appointment of the Chief Executive of the Ministry as a special advisor to the board. It's wonderful language. It says the task of the CEO in that context will be to assist the board to align its strategies and activities with government policies. And a rough translation of that, call me cynical if you will, but I see that as this is the fellow or the person who will give the board its marching orders. That it will be told very clearly what it ought to be doing on any given time, what its approach should be, and indeed where it ought to be directing its funding. And that's a key issue I'll come to later. The name of this organisation to be Callaghan Innovation, we didn't oppose that clearly, though we have considerable misgivings about it. Not least of all because this is exactly the sort of approach that's embedded in this bill that the late Sir Paul Callaghan actually warned us against. Sir Paul said, picking winners is not a strategy that has worked well for us in the past. And the way this organisation is set up, it's clearly intended to do that, to pick winners and to fund them, to support them. Sir Paul said, quote, "We will be good at what we're good at." He said the big thing, he said, in the future will take us by surprise in the same way that things like LanzaTech took us to some extent by surprise. He said we need to target niche markets, the wonderful line he came up with that we've all used and believe in, that we want to make New Zealand a place where talent wants to live. The way this organisation is set up is contrary to the advice that was left us by Sir Paul. So in the clause 12 in the bill, the main objective, it talks about support and innovation for commercialisation, linking the extraordinary science and research talent we have here, the innovative capacity of business to turn good ideas into earners for the country. And we certainly need and want those, and there is a considerable proposition there. What this bill rather overlooks, though, the sector, neither business nor the research sector, has been sitting idly on their hands waiting for something or somebody to come along to create a bridge between the two. There are a whole host of very, very successful enterprises, organisations, sets of... Mr Chair.
I call the Honourable Member David Cleandon.
Thank you, Mr Chair. We already have a number of very successful organisations, Uniservices, Waikato Link, Lincoln Ventures, the various economic development agencies around the country have invested considerably, and they've developed very successful and positive relationships with business, with development bodies. And it's rather interesting to ask the question, what will become of these relationships? And it's a very obvious question to ask. How will the ATI kind of interact with these existing sets of relationships and organisations? And the Select Committee quite sensibly and obviously asked the question. The answer we got back, and I quote from Moby, no decision has been made about how ATI will interact, though it is recognised this is an important aspect of how ATI carries out its function. And this is one of the themes that runs through this legislation. We've been asked to sign off on something, to support a bill, not knowing a great deal of the content of how this organisation will work. There's a great deal we simply do not know. There are simply too many unanswered key questions for us to offer support to this legislation. And a little bit more time, maybe would have been persuaded, maybe the work could have been done. We understand there'll be a report back to Cabinet at the end of this month, by which time, in all likelihood, this bill will be done and dusted. Rather too late, really, for us to be informed when we're making decisions, which, after all, is our task in this House. Clause 13(1)(c) allows for a degree of reciprocity between business and the research sector, the tertiary and other research organisations. And that is a change we effected in Select Committee, and I think it's a good one. The original drafting anticipated a one-way flow from the research sector into business, and clearly that's not how the world works, and it's not how we want it to work. So that clause does allow for a degree of reciprocity and acknowledges that the work, the research, the ideas and innovation can cut across a two-way path, and that's a useful improvement we did manage to make to the bill. I guess the major clause that's the deal breaker for the Greens is 13(1)(d), which simply says the ATI will allocate and administer research, science and technology funding, full stop. Again, the very obvious question that was asked by the committee is what funding? Which of the various funding streams will be handed over to ATI to administer, to allocate? Will there be new money? And frankly, we think in the present financial environment that's unlikely, and legitimately so, you might say. Again, the answer to the Select Committee from Moby, I quote, no decisions have been made regarding which funding the ATI will administer because Moby is currently reviewing the schemes. A Cabinet report back is due by 30 November this year. Once again, we've been asked to take this on trust, and this is one of the issues that is of major concern to the various research organisations, the CRIs, the universities. We know this because we've talked to them personally and individually. They are seriously worried about what this means for their future, frankly, for their ability to continue with existing research work, to pick up new contracts, to go into the future. Why has this not been made more clear before the legislation is passed? It seems an extraordinarily wide and open-ended provision, and the concern is clearly that most, if not all, of the contestable funding will be channelled through this new ATI, through the Callaghan Innovation, and that will be completely an undesirable sort of a setup. It's not, again, reflecting on Sir Paul's caution that backing winners has not worked for us. We need a considerably more diverse range of funding streams, decision-making points than a single entity handing out most or all of the contestable funding would allow for us. It is something that came through in a fairly subdued way, I'd have to confess, in the submissions, but certainly individual academics, researchers, scientists have been rather more pointed in their one-to-one the information that they're given to us informally. Clearly, they frankly realise that they do not want to rock the boat. They understand that that the relationship they have with the Minister is an important one, and there is a degree of concern that making too much noise about this bill might have undesirable consequences into the future. And again, that's very unfortunate that that lack of trust is coming through to us from very well-respected and successful academics and scientists.
I call the honourable member Tracy Martin.
Kia ora. Kia ora, Mr Chair. Thank you very